NATO had given up. Delta Force was trapped. The world's most powerful army had fallen silent. But then, out of nowhere, a woman they had dismissed as irrelevant did the impossible. She climbed into an F-35 and rewrote history. This isn't just about war. This is about silence, humiliation, and a revenge so unexpected you won't believe it. And when NATO finally saw who was in that cockpit, they couldn't believe it. Who was she? Why did NATO fall silent? And what really happened in the skies that day? Before we dive in, hit subscribe to A Simple Woman, where every silence hides power and every humiliation hides a twist you'll never see coming. The ground trembled beneath the weight of artillery. Smoke clawed its way through the broken skyline of the valley, a suffocating blanket of dust and fire. Delta Force had fought until their last breath, but the walls were closing in. Colonel David Ruiz crouched behind the shattered remains of an armored vehicle, his radio pressed against his ear, the static of failure ringing louder than the artillery outside. "Command, do you copy?" "Command." The line died again, nothing but white noise. His men, exhausted and bloodied, exchanged glances that carried the truth no soldier wanted to admit. They were out of options. Overhead, enemy drones buzzed like vultures circling a dying prey. Every attempt at calling for air support had been jammed. Their supply lines were cut. The once indomitable NATO presence in this region had collapsed into fragments of desperation. Ruiz clenched his jaw, watching one of his sergeants drag a wounded soldier across. The rubble, dust streaking their faces, blood painting their uniforms. He muttered the words no commander ever wanted to speak. "We're not going to make it." In the distance, NATO command sat in silence. Screens flickered with static. Maps were littered with red markers where blue once held the line. General Marcus Hale stood frozen in the command bunker, his decorated uniform smeared with the sweat of failure. Around him, officers whispered in disbelief, their voices trembling with words like retreat, surrender, evacuation. NATO, the alliance built on strength, on unity, was watching its mission collapse in real time. And then, as if to seal their fate, the last comms feed from Delta Force blinked out. Hale lowered his head, his fists pressed against the steel table, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've lost them." But not everyone had surrendered to silence. In the corner of that same bunker, Captain Sarah Voss scanned the feeds with eyes that refused to look away. Her fingers danced over the console, desperately searching for any sign of life, any signal, any miracle. Yet nothing answered. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, the inevitability of defeat crushing every hope she still clung to. NATO command had fallen into silence, not from lack of strength, but from disbelief that the unthinkable had actually happened. Far from the chaos, in the shadows of a battered airbase, Isabella Raven Moretti stood alone. Once a test pilot, once a rising star, now little more than a forgotten name. She had been dismissed as reckless, a liability, someone who didn't fit the mold of NATO's pristine elite. They had buried her in logistics, a quiet exile meant to erase her fire, but the fire had never died. It smoldered, waiting, biding its time for the day when silence would no longer be enough. And that day had come. Raven's boots crunched against the cracked pavement of the deserted runway, her eyes fixed on the silhouette that towered at the end of the strip, the F-35 Lightning II. Sleek, black, silent, a machine designed for precision, for dominance. The others had abandoned it, convinced the battle was already lost, that no single aircraft could turn the tide. But they had underestimated two things: the plane and the woman who still had the courage to climb into it. Isabella Raven Moretti had not always been a shadow on the edges of war. Once, her name carried the weight of promise. At 24, she was a prodigy, the kind of pilot who could make an aircraft sing. In training, her instructors marveled at her instincts, the way she seemed to feel the sky rather than calculate it, the way she could turn a near stall into a perfect climb with nothing but raw intuition. She was born for the cockpit. Everyone saw it, and for a moment she believed it too. But the higher she flew, the harder the world tried to drag her down. She was not the kind of soldier the old guard trusted. She asked too many questions, challenged too many orders. When others bowed their heads, she lifted hers. When the generals demanded blind obedience, she gave them sharp truths. And in a system built on hierarchy, sharp truths cut deeper than bullets. Her fall came in whispers. First, a reprimand for insubordination. Then, an accusation that she was reckless, too emotional, a liability in combat. The final blow was a tribunal after a training incident where her split-second decisions saved her squadron from disaster but embarrassed a superior officer whose plan she had disobeyed. The official record stripped her of commendations, burying the heroism beneath the stain of defiance. By the time she was 30, Raven was no longer a fighter pilot. She was reassigned to logistics at a forgotten NATO base, a warehouse of supplies and broken machines. Her once pristine flight suit was replaced with olive-drab fatigues. Her world reduced to inventory checklists and the silence of being ignored. To her colleagues, she was a failure, a cautionary tale of wasted talent. To the men she had once flown beside, she was a joke whispered over drinks. Yet inside, Raven's fire had not dimmed. Every insult carved deeper into her resolve. Every dismissal hardened her silence into steel. She trained in secret, studying the manuals of the F-35, running simulations at night, keeping her skills alive in the shadows. While the world forgot her, she sharpened herself into something sharper than they could imagine. And now, as the base shook from distant explosions, as the screams of a collapsing mission echoed across the radio waves, Raven stood at the edge of the runway and looked at the jet they had abandoned. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice before her. The F-35 loomed before her like a monument to everything she had lost and everything she still craved. Its fuselage gleamed faintly in the fractured daylight, sleek and lethal, a predator built for the sky. To others, it was just hardware, too advanced to matter now, too vulnerable against the tide of enemy firepower. But to Raven, it was the one voice she still trusted. Machines didn't lie, the sky didn't betray, only people did. Her boots slowed as she reached the ladder. For a moment she hesitated, her reflection caught in the canopy glass. The woman staring back was not the golden pilot of her youth. She was older now, her eyes harder, her face etched with lines carved by years of exile. But within that reflection burned the same defiance, the same hunger, the same refusal to vanish quietly. She pressed a gloved hand against the cold metal of the jet. "They said I was nothing," she whispered. "Let's prove them wrong." The memory of the tribunal came rushing back, the smirks of her superiors, the patronizing tone of the generals, the whispers of men who called her impulsive, unstable, unfit. She remembered standing in that sterile room as her career was stripped away, her words drowned by the weight of rank and tradition. That humiliation had followed her, a shadow she could never outrun. And yet, it was that same humiliation that now gave her strength. The distant thunder of artillery snapped her back to the present. Raven's jaw tightened. NATO command might have surrendered to silence, but she would not. Delta Force might have run out of options, but she would carve a new one. She climbed the ladder with the certainty of someone stepping into destiny. Each rung carried the weight of every insult, every dismissal, every time they had told her she didn't belong. And with each step she turned their scorn into fuel. Sliding into the cockpit felt like coming home. The seat embraced her. The controls beneath her fingertips thrummed with latent power. She breathed deeply, the oxygen mask cool against her skin, the familiar scent of metal and fuel filling her lungs like a drug. She flicked the switches with muscle memory no exile could erase. Systems hummed to life, one by one, until the jet was no longer a dormant machine but a living thing, a beast waiting to be unleashed. For a heartbeat, doubt crept in. She was alone. No backup, no orders, no guarantee that she could make a difference against the tide of firepower outside. But then she thought of Ruiz and his men bleeding in the dirt, of the silence, choking NATO command, of the laughter of those who had written her off. And the doubt vanished. She wasn't flying for NATO. She wasn't flying for the generals who had betrayed her. She was flying for herself, for the silence, for the humiliation, for the revenge. The canopy sealed shut with a hiss. Raven wrapped her hands around the controls and whispered to herself, "A promise more than a prayer. This time they'll remember my name." The F-35 roared to life, its engines igniting the air and the ground beneath her shook as if the earth itself recognized the return of a predator to the sky. Colonel David Ruiz pressed his back against the jagged steel of a destroyed personnel carrier, his breath ragged, his uniform smeared with dust and blood. The acrid smell of burning fuel hung heavy in the air, mingling with the copper stench of blood. Around him, what remained of Delta Force clung to whatever scraps of cover they could find, their once tight formation now scattered ruins of exhausted men. The valley that had been their battleground was a graveyard of broken vehicles, twisted metal and shattered bodies. Every few seconds the shriek of incoming artillery ripped the air apart, followed by the earth-shaking concussions that drove more dust into already choking lungs. Ruiz glanced at the lifeless radio lying in the dirt beside him. Its casing was dented, the antenna snapped, but worse than the damage was the silence. No voice, no orders, no hope. He had spent his life believing Delta Force was unbreakable, that no matter the odds, they always found a way. But now, staring at his men slumped in the mud, their helmets cracked, their eyes hollow, he felt the unthinkable gnaw at his resolve. They had reached the end. Nearby, Sergeant Miller staggered toward him, dragging Corporal Hayes, who clutched his side where blood poured through torn fabric. "Colonel," Miller rasped, his voice shredded by smoke, "we can't hold them. We need air cover, or—" His words died as another explosion shook the ground, forcing them both into the dirt. Hayes screamed, a raw animal sound that cut straight through Ruiz's chest. The colonel slammed his fist against the ruined vehicle, fury and helplessness colliding in a single gesture. "There is no air cover!" he barked. "Command isn't answering. We're on our own." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He wanted to believe there was still a chance, that somehow reinforcements were coming, but lying to his men now would be worse than the truth. One by one, his soldiers turned their eyes toward him. They didn't ask for comfort or strategy. They had seen too much for that. What they wanted was impossible, a miracle. Ruiz met their stares and felt the weight of each one press against him like chains. He was their commander, but what could he command now? Broken weapons, empty magazines, men who had nothing left to give but their last breaths? Another blast erupted just yards away, pelting them with shards of rock and shrapnel. Private Jenkins, barely 20, collapsed face first in the dirt, a spray of crimson marking the end of his short war. Ruiz clenched his teeth, the rage and sorrow threatening to tear him apart. "God damn it!" he roared into the chaos, his voice swallowed by the storm of fire. For the first time in his career, Ruiz allowed the thought he had always banished, defeat, and once it entered, it refused to leave. Colonel Ruiz crouched lower, wiping grime from his eyes as the sky above them split open with the roar of enemy fire. He scanned what was left of his unit, fewer than a dozen men, battered and bleeding, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Each of them had once been trained to be unbreakable, yet here, in the Valley of Death, even the strongest looked hollow. A burst of machine gun fire ripped across their position, forcing them deeper into cover. Ruiz felt his heart pound as he realized how thin their defenses had become. Ammunition was almost gone. Medics were out of supplies. The wounded groaned in the dust, clutching at bandages that could no longer hold back the tide. And still the enemy pressed closer, their silhouettes advancing through the haze like relentless shadows. "Colonel," Sergeant Miller rasped again, his voice raw, "we've got to move, or we're done here." Ruiz looked at him and saw not just a soldier, but a man begging for salvation that didn't exist. To stay meant certain death. To move meant walking straight into enemy lines. He swallowed hard, the weight of command crushing him in a way bullets never could. He picked up the ruined radio and slammed it against the ground, a desperate, futile gesture. The static hissed back at him like mockery. For hours they had tried. Hail after hail to NATO command, begging for extraction, for cover, for anything. And for hours there had been nothing, just silence. The alliance that promised never to abandon them had turned into a ghost. Ruiz's vision blurred, not from injury, but from rage. He remembered every oath he had sworn, every promise he had made to his men that they would never be left behind. Yet here he was, leading them into oblivion. He opened his mouth to speak, to give the order no commander ever wanted to give, but the words stuck in his throat. How do you tell your soldiers that everything they fought for was over? A mortar landed close enough to lift him off his feet, slamming him against the wreckage of a Humvee. His ears rang, his chest burned, but as he staggered upright, he heard the words slip from his lips before he could stop them. "We're out of options." The men around him froze. Some lowered their weapons, others closed their eyes, accepting the inevitable. For a moment, the battlefield grew eerily quiet, as if even the war itself was pausing to listen. Ruiz had said it aloud, the unthinkable, the end. Yet somewhere beyond the smoke, above the chaos, fate was already shifting. The cockpit hummed with power as Raven flipped the final switches. Screens lit up, casting a pale glow across her determined face. Every vibration of the jet pulsed through her bones, steadying her like a heartbeat. She exhaled slowly, her hands wrapping around the throttle and stick, the weight of every humiliation she had endured, now focused into one single motion. Outside, the runway stretched before her, cracked and littered with debris. A path that seemed less like an escape and more like a dare. "Systems check complete," she muttered to herself, though no one was listening. For years she had been silenced, ignored, buried. Now, the silence belonged to her. The canopy sealed her inside, shutting out the chaos of the world, leaving only her and the machine. She was no longer the outcast or the forgotten. She was the pilot, and this was her sky. The base was half abandoned, its few remaining personnel scrambling in disbelief as the F-35 roared to life. A mechanic standing near the hangar froze, eyes wide, unable to process the sight of a woman they thought relegated to filing papers, now sitting in the cockpit of NATO's most advanced jet. Some shouted after her, their voices lost in the thunder of the engines, warning her that the runway was compromised, that she would never make it airborne. Raven ignored them. She had spent too many years listening to voices that doubted her. Her eyes flicked to the horizon. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the battlefield. Smoke rising, the dull flashes of artillery like a heartbeat of destruction. Somewhere in that inferno, Ruiz and his men were waiting for a miracle that would never come, unless she made it happen. Her jaw tightened. She eased the throttle forward, and the jet trembled like a predator straining at the leash. The engines screamed, shattering the silence of the airfield. Heat rippled across the cracked pavement, and dust billowed into the air as the F-35 began to roll. The vibration grew, rattling through her seat, pressing her into the machine, until she could no longer tell where the jet ended and she began. Faster and faster, the world blurred outside her canopy, the cracked runway becoming a streak beneath her wheels. And then, an explosion. The far end of the runway erupted as artillery shells found their mark, showering the tarmac with fire and jagged steel. The shockwave rattled the jet, alarms screaming across her displays. If she hesitated, if she slowed, the blast would consume her. But Raven's eyes hardened. There was no turning back, not anymore. The jet bucked as the shockwave rolled over it, but Raven shoved the throttle forward until it hit the stop. The F-35 roared like a beast unchained, wheels hammering against, fractured asphalt as flames licked at the edge of the runway. Warning lights flared red across her display, but she didn't blink. Every alarm was a voice from her past telling her she couldn't, and every second she kept going was proof that she could. The cracked tarmac ended in fire. Beyond it, only smoke and ruin waited. She had seconds, maybe less, before the collapsing runway sealed her fate. Raven gritted her teeth, her eyes locked on the thin ribbon of sky ahead. "Fly," she whispered, not to the machine but to herself. She yanked back on the stick. For a heartbeat, the jet resisted, heavy and earthbound, its wheels clinging desperately to the ground. Then the engines screamed higher, the lift surged beneath the wings, and the impossible happened. The F-35 tore free of the earth, rising above the flames in a single defiant leap. The blast behind her consumed the end of the runway, fire swallowing the space where she had been seconds before. Had she hesitated for even a breath, she would have been nothing but ash and twisted metal. Instead, she was in the sky, the canopy filled with endless horizon, the machine alive beneath her hands. The airfield shrank below, a scar on the earth fading into distance. Raven steadied the jet, her chest heaving, her pulse thunderous in her ears. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The silence that had once defined her was gone, replaced by the roar of the engines and the steady hum of power. She was airborne again, and this time there was no one to stop her. Far off, the battlefield stretched like a nightmare across the land, streaks of smoke marking the front lines where Ruiz and his men were being crushed. Her HUD flickered with enemy radar locks, warning pings filling her display. Anti-air batteries had already spotted her, and missiles were being prepared. NATO command might have gone silent, but the enemy had not. They were awake, and they were waiting. Raven pushed the stick forward, her eyes narrowing. Let them come. This wasn't just about saving Delta Force anymore. This was about proving what silence could hide, what humiliation could create, what revenge could unleash. And as the jet carved into the sky, Raven whispered the vow that would carry her into the storm. "They'll remember me." The sky lit up with hostility the moment Raven crossed into enemy airspace. Radar locks pulsed across her HUD in rapid succession, each one a promise of incoming fire. The air was thick with danger, and before she could even settle into her climb, the first missile streaked upward, a lance of fire cutting through the haze. Missile inbound, the onboard system barked, its mechanical calmness a cruel contrast to the chaos outside. Raven's grip tightened on the stick. She rolled the F-35 hard to the left, the jet groaning as it bent the air around it. The missile screamed past, so close the heat shimmer rattled her canopy. For a second she caught her breath, but the second missile was already on its way. Then the third, then the fourth. Below, the enemy had turned the entire valley into a fortress of fire. Anti-aircraft batteries spat glowing trails into the heavens, each shell bursting into a black cloud of shrapnel. The sky wasn't just hostile, it was a cage, one designed to shred anything that dared to enter. NATO had called this airspace a no-fly zone for months, and for good reason. No pilot had survived it. But Raven wasn't just any pilot. Her eyes narrowed, her breathing slowed. Years of training buried under dust and silence surged back into her veins. The battlefield ahead wasn't chaos, it was a puzzle, and she could see the patterns hidden in the madness. Every gun had a rhythm, every missile launcher a window of reload. She tilted the jet into a dive, then cut hard upward, threading the needle, between two blossoms of fire that detonated a split second too late. Her body slammed against the seat, G-forces clawing at her ribs, but she gritted her teeth and forced the plane higher, faster. More alarms screamed. Another missile lock. She thumbed the countermeasures, and flares erupted from the belly of the jet, painting the sky with false suns. The missile veered, confused, detonating harmlessly behind her. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself a grim smile. They had thought she was finished. They had thought silence was her end. But here she was, tearing through a storm no one else dared to enter. Below, Colonel Ruiz's battered squad caught sight of the impossible, a lone jet ripping across the sky, weaving through a storm of fire that should have annihilated it. Men lifted their heads from the dirt, their hollow eyes sparking with something they hadn't felt in hours: hope. The sky turned into a battlefield of its own, every inch alive with smoke and flame. Tracers sliced past her canopy like burning needles, while the dull thunder of flak shells reverberated through the fuselage. Each burst lit up her cockpit with flashes of white and orange, shadows strobing across her face as if the heavens themselves were trying to blind her. A fresh wave of missiles streaked upward, this time in a swarm. Raven's HUD lit up red, an orchestra of warnings demanding she eject, escape, surrender. But surrender wasn't an option. She pushed the F-35 into a near-vertical climb, the jet howling as it clawed for altitude. The missiles followed, their trails converging like predators scenting blood. At the last second, Raven cut the throttle, rolled the jet onto its back, and plunged into a dive. Gravity yanked her stomach into her throat, her body crushed by the G-forces, but she refused to black out. The missiles overshot, slamming into one another in a chain of explosions that shook the sky behind her. Fire bloomed in her wake, a chaotic storm she had turned against itself. Raven leveled out, the jet slicing low over the ridgeline, so close she could see the silhouettes of enemy gunners below scrambling to re-aim their weapons. Another barrage erupted, this time from a battery hidden deep in the valley. Flak bursts bracketed her path, black blossoms tearing the air apart. Raven gritted her teeth and rolled the jet sideways, flying knife-edge between two detonations. Shrapnel pinged against her wings, sparks flaring across the glass canopy. For For a moment she felt the sting of fear, that one hit could end her, that the storm might finally consume her. But fear wasn't an anchor anymore. Fear was fuel. She pulled up hard, skimming over the ridge. The sudden silence on the other side hit her like a gasp of air after drowning. The jet steadied, the sky opening before her. She had done it, slipped through the no-fly zone that had claimed every pilot before her. Far below, Ruiz and his men stared in stunned disbelief. They had seen her dance with death, weaving through the impossible. And now, as the flak faded and her jet roared above them, the hopeless silence that had hung over the battlefield cracked wide open. For the first time that day, Delta Force believed they might live. Raven glanced at her radar, her lips tightening into something between defiance and promise. She wasn't done. Not yet. The real strike was still to come. Raven steadied the F-35, her breathing measured, the storm of anti-air fire fading behind her. On her HUD, the battlefield below flickered alive in green outlines, armored columns pressing forward, artillery, positions spitting death, and the faint blue markers of Delta Force barely clinging to survival. They were pinned against a ravine, cut off, surrounded, with nowhere left to go. Ruiz's last words echoed in her head. "We're out of options. Not anymore." Her thumb hovered over the weapons controls, her mind racing through the possibilities. This wasn't just about firepower, it was about precision. If she missed, even by a few feet, Ruiz's men would be buried along with their enemies. She locked onto the nearest artillery battery, its barrel still glowing from the last round it had fired. The targeting reticle pulsed red, steady, waiting for her command. "Let's remind them what silence can do," she muttered. With a squeeze of the trigger, the F-35 unleashed its wrath. A pair of precision-guided bombs detached from the wings, slicing through the air like hawks in a dive. Raven pulled the jet into a steep climb, and seconds later the valley below erupted in fire. The artillery battery vanished in a thunderclap, smoke and debris billowing skyward. The shockwave rolled across the battlefield, tossing enemy infantry into the dirt like rag dolls. Delta Force lifted their heads from the mud. Disbelief etched across their faces. Sergeant Miller blinked against the dust, his voice hoarse as he shouted over the roar of the explosion. "Jesus Christ, air support! Who the hell?" Ruiz staggered upright, eyes locked on the jet cutting through the sky above. His chest tightened, a spark of something dangerous flickering in his heart. Hope, but the strike was only the beginning. Enemy vehicles scrambled to reposition, their guns swiveling skyward, desperate to track the predator now stalking them from above. Raven's HUD lit up again, targets flooding her vision. Tanks, rocket launchers, troop carriers, each one a hammer crushing Ruiz's men into the dirt. Her jaw clenched. One by one she would take them apart. Raven rolled the F-35 hard, the world spinning beneath her, the targeting reticles flickering across her HUD like a deadly constellation. She selected a cluster of armored vehicles that had cornered Delta Force against the ravine. With a sharp exhale, she released 2 more guided bombs. The jet lurched upward as the payload dropped, and seconds later, the valley shook with another eruption. Fire engulfed the tanks, their steel carcasses torn open like tin, the shockwave flattening infantry that had been advancing behind them. Ruiz's men stared, their hollow expressions breaking into something almost alien on their battle-worn faces, relief. For hours they had been drowning in silence, abandoned by command, left to die. And now, out of nowhere, salvation had descended from the skies in the form of a jet tearing the battlefield apart. But Raven wasn't finished. Enemy anti-air vehicles swiveled, their cannons tracking her sleek silhouette. Warnings screamed across her cockpit as fresh missile locks flashed red. She didn't retreat. She dove lower, skimming the ridgeline so close the treetops whipped against her wings. The enemy launched their missiles in panic, but her countermeasures flared, dazzling the weapons into detonating harmlessly in the clouds above. "Your turn," she whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. The F-35's cannon thundered, ripping the air apart with a stream of depleted uranium rounds. The shells shredded through the first anti-air vehicle, its turret exploding in a spray of fire and twisted metal. She banked, cut across the valley, and tore another into pieces before they could reload. Below, Ruiz's surviving squad rallied. Miller shouted through the smoke, pointing skyward as Raven's jet screamed overhead. "She's clearing us a path! Push forward!" The battered remnants of Delta Force surged with newfound energy. They scrambled from cover, firing into the retreating enemy lines. For the first time that day, it was not desperation driving them. It was momentum. Raven climbed sharply, pulling into the clouds. Her hands shook, her lungs burned, but her eyes were sharp. The impossible had happened. Delta Force was alive, not because of NATO, not because of command, but because one woman they had dismissed had refused to stay silent. She steadied the jet, her voice low and fierce inside the cockpit. "This is only the beginning." The command center in Brussels was a cathedral of screens, every wall alive with maps, satellite feeds, and streams of encrypted comms. Normally, it buzzed with the calm confidence of an alliance that had seen everything, but now silence gripped the room. Generals, analysts, and ministers stood frozen, their eyes locked on a single screen that defied every briefing, every expectation. An F-35 had just torn open the battlefield. Alone, no authorization, no mission order, no squadron backing it up. And yet, it had accomplished in minutes what months of strategy had failed to do. It broke the stranglehold crushing Delta Force. General Marcus Hale leaned forward on the polished steel table, his knuckles white, his jaw tight. "Who the hell is flying that bird?" His voice cut through the silence like a blade, but no one answered. Dozens of operators scrambled at their terminals, pulling ID tags, transponder data, biometric readings from the cockpit. Everything came back the same, classified, scrambled, impossible to pin down. The big screen replayed footage from a satellite drone, the jet diving through curtains, of flak weaving between missiles and striking with surgical precision. A younger officer muttered under his breath, barely audible, "No one flies like that." Hale slammed his hand on the table. "Find me a name, now!" The room erupted into frantic keystrokes and comms chatter. Analysts compared maneuvers against known pilot rosters. They cross-checked every NATO ace, every active squadron, even those retired. One by one, the results narrowed. And then, confusion. The system flagged a match, but the name was so unexpected that the officer reading it hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the signature matches Isabella Moretti." The name hung in the air like a ghost. Some of the younger staff blinked in confusion, but among the older officers, recognition hit like a blow. They remembered her, not as a hero, not as an ace, but as a problem. A pilot who had been quietly sidelined, shuffled into irrelevance. A woman whose career had been buried under whispers of insubordination, of being too reckless, too emotional. And yet, here she was, rewriting the war. Hale's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He had personally signed the papers that had pulled her from active duty. Now, As he watched her F-35 carve the sky with impossible defiance, he realized the consequences of that decision were about to come crashing back in ways no one could control. The command center erupted in overlapping voices the moment Isabella's name was confirmed. Some officers scoffed, others whispered in disbelief, and a few simply stared at the screen as though it had betrayed them. "She was grounded," one colonel muttered, shaking his head. "Wasn't she discharged from flight duty 3 years ago?" "Not discharged," another corrected bitterly. "Buried. You buried her." Hale didn't flinch at the accusation. His eyes stayed locked on the main display, where Raven's F-35 cut across the battlefield like a blade through smoke. Every maneuver she executed was flawless, a combination of instinct and calculation no algorithm could predict. And as the Delta Force rallied below, Hale realized something he had never wanted to admit. The pilot they had dismissed as irrelevant was now the only one winning this war. A civilian advisor, pale and shaken, leaned across the table. "General, if this footage goes public, if anyone learns NATO command abandoned Delta Force while a forgotten pilot saved them..." "Enough!" Hale snapped, his voice sharp enough to still the room. He straightened, his silhouette stark against the wall of screens. "We control this narrative. We control what the world sees." But even as he said it, Hale knew the truth. There was no controlling Raven. She had already seized the story by sheer force of survival. NATO hadn't ordered her into that jet. NATO hadn't authorized her strikes. She had made her own war. And won. Operators turned in their chairs, hesitant, their eyes darting toward Hale as if searching for guidance. He gave none. For the first time in his career, the general had nothing to say. On the screen, Raven banked the F-35 sharply, sunlight catching the sleek body of the jet. For a brief second, her face flickered across one of the drone feeds. A grainy image through. The canopy, eyes hard, jaw set, every line of her expression radiating defiance. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Every man and woman there understood what it meant. NATO's command, the generals who had silenced her, were now spectators to the greatest act of defiance in their history. And when Raven's voice finally came through, crackling over the intercepted channel, it was a knife twisted deep. "You thought I was gone, but I'm the only reason your soldiers are still breathing." The room froze. Hale's face darkened, but inside, a quiet dread gnawed at him. The war was no longer in NATO's hands. It belonged to her. The battlefield had been a graveyard just minutes ago. Smoke curled from burning vehicles, the air thick with ash and the bitter taste of defeat. But now, the rhythm of war shifted. Raven's F-35 screamed across the valley, a shadow of vengeance that refused to die. Every strike she unleashed carved a new path. Every maneuver shattered the illusion of enemy invincibility. Ruiz could feel it in his bones. He crouched behind the wreck of a troop carrier, watching in awe as Ravens. Bombs obliterated a fortified position that had pinned his men for hours. Dust and fire swallowed the ridge, and for the first time that day, his squad surged forward instead of falling back. "Move!" Ruiz barked, his voice no longer heavy with despair but sharp with renewed purpose. Enemy lines faltered. Soldiers who had marched confidently just an hour before now stumbled in. Confusion, their eyes fixed skyward, tracking the jet that hunted them. Tanks rotated their turrets in desperation, firing wildly at a target too fast to hit. Each wasted shell only deepened their panic. High above, Raven's focus narrowed. The HUD swarmed with targets, but she had no intention of fighting piecemeal. She saw the spine of the enemy formation, the command vehicles clustered. In the rear, orchestrating the slaughter with cold precision. If she broke that, the entire offensive would collapse. She rolled the F-35 onto its back, sunlight glinting off the canopy as she lined up her shot. The targeting reticle locked onto the convoy, each vehicle a glowing red marker begging to be erased. Her hand hovered for a heartbeat, steady as stone. Then she released. A brace of precision missiles screamed free, carving contrails across the sky. They struck seconds later, ripping into the convoy with surgical brutality. Command vehicles vanished in fireballs, comms trucks shredded into twisted metal. The enemy's coordination dissolved instantly, their movements unraveling into chaos. Below, Delta Force surged. Miller shouted over the gunfire, pointing as the enemy line broke apart. "They're running! Push them back!" The battered squad advanced with a ferocity born not just of survival, but of vengeance. And for the first time all day, the battlefield belonged to them. The collapse of enemy command rippled through the valley like a crack through glass. What had once been a coordinated push now fractured into fragments of confusion. Units that had advanced with mechanical precision froze mid-step, their officers silenced, their orders lost in the firestorm that had consumed their leaders. From her cockpit, Raven could see it unfolding, the unraveling of a machine that had seemed unstoppable. Tanks stalled, infantry scattered, anti-air turrets fired blindly into empty sky. The enemy had lost its heartbeat. She dove low, her jet tearing through the smoke, close enough for the ground forces to feel the shockwave of her passage. To the soldiers below, she wasn't just a pilot. She was a storm, a force of nature rewriting the rules of survival. Every roar of her engines was a rallying cry, every strike a reminder that silence had teeth. Ruiz's voice cracked over the squad's comms, no longer broken, no longer defeated. "Advance! Take the ridge while they're blind!" His men surged forward, their boots pounding into the dirt, their rifles blazing. For the first time in hours, the Delta Force wasn't fighting to hold the line. They were taking ground. Enemy soldiers began throwing down their weapons, some retreating in blind panic. Others collapsing under the weight of artillery fire redirected against them. What had been certain victory dissolved into rout, and all of it hinged on a single jet, flown by the one woman NATO had erased from its story. Back in Brussels, the command center watched the feeds in silence, the shock on every face undeniable. Raven wasn't just saving Delta Force, she was reshaping the war in real time, proving in full view of the world that NATO's silence had been a mistake, too costly to ignore. Inside the cockpit, Raven's lips pressed into a thin, determined line. The tide had turned, but she knew this was only the beginning. The enemy wasn't gone, not yet. But for the first time in years, she wasn't the forgotten pilot, the silenced soldier, the ghost in the system. She was the one writing history. The smoke of battle still clung to the valley, curling in the air like the memory of fire. Delta Force had rallied, their boots grinding over ground they never thought they'd see again, driving the enemy into full retreat. And high above them, the shadow of an F-35 cut lazy arcs across the sky, victorious, commanding, untouchable. But inside the cockpit, Raven sat in silence. Her hands trembled on the stick, not from fear, but from the weight of everything pressing down at once. Victory should have felt like fire in her veins. Instead, it felt like ash. Her comms crackled. At first, only static. Then the clipped, polished voice of NATO command broke through. "Pilot, identify yourself! You are operating outside of all authorized parameters. This is a violation of international protocol. Stand down immediately." Raven let the words wash over her, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. They still didn't get it. Even after she had saved the men they had abandoned, even after she had turned the tide of a battle already marked as lost, all they could see was insubordination, a violation, a mistake. Her fingers danced over the comms switch, and then her voice cut into the command center, raw and unshakable. "You left them to die." The silence that followed was deeper than any she had known. Dozens of generals, ministers, strategists, all of them men who had shaped wars with words and signatures, were forced to hear her accusation ring out across the channel. "You signed their death sentences when you pulled the plug," Raven continued, her voice steady, almost calm. "You told the world there was no way forward. And when you silenced me, you thought you erased the problem. But I was never the problem. You were." In Brussels, Hale stood motionless, his jaw tight, his hand hovering uselessly above the console. He could have cut the feed, muted her, shut her down. But the eyes in the room, those of his staff, his officers, even the civilian liaisons, were locked on him. If he silenced her now, he would only prove her point. On the screen, Raven's image flickered again, her face caught by a drone's lens as she turned in the cockpit. Her eyes burned with the clarity of a woman who had lost everything and decided she had nothing left to fear. "You called me reckless, you called me unstable, you stripped me of my wings because you were afraid of what it would mean if I succeeded, and now here we are. Your silence almost killed every man on that ground. My defiance is the only reason they still breathe." Below, Ruiz and his squad listened in awe as her words bled into their radios. They crouched behind cover, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Every syllable was a vindication, every phrase a hammer striking the coffin of the command that had written them off. In the command center, no one moved. No one breathed. The weight of her indictment hung in the air like a guillotine. Then Raven delivered the final cut. "I'm not your mistake to erase. I'm the proof you were wrong. And from this moment on, the world will know it wasn't NATO who saved Delta Force. It was the pilot you buried. It was Isabella Moretti." Her name, spoken in her own voice, detonated across every channel like a charge. NATO could bury files, silence reports, redact records, but they couldn't erase her now. The soldiers on the ground knew her name. The feeds transmitting from drones knew her name. And the world, watching the battlefield crack open in real time, would know it too. General Hale's hand finally dropped, limp at his side. There was nothing left to say. He had silenced her once. He would never silence her again. Raven pulled the jet higher, piercing through the clouds. The battle below was hers. The silence that had suffocated her for years had become her weapon. And now, it was NATO that sat in silence, crushed under the truth of her defiance. For the first time in her life, Raven wasn't just a pilot. She was the reckoning. The valley was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard of steel and fire. Enemy forces scattered in chaos, broken by the storm Raven had unleashed. Delta Force, battered but alive, pushed forward, their voices raw with the desperate. Roar of men who had stared into the abyss and clawed their way back. And high above them, Raven climbed through the last shreds of smoke, the F-35 rising into the clean blue sky. She should have felt triumphant. She had turned defeat into victory, silence into power. But she knew it wasn't over. Her comms crackled again, this time not with the cold detachment of NATO command, but with a quiet, strained voice. It was Ruiz. "Whoever you are, whoever the hell you are up there, you just saved us. My men, we owe you everything." Raven closed her eyes for half a second. She could almost hear the disbelief in his tone, the way gratitude and awe twisted into something more fragile, shame. She had been the one they dismissed, the one NATO discarded, and now the men on the ground, The very soldiers who had fought and bled while their command abandoned them were looking skyward at her silhouette as if she was the only thing holding the world together. She keyed the comms, her voice steady. "My name is Raven. Remember it. Because NATO won't want you to." The line went silent, but she knew her words had landed. Ruiz would remember. His men would remember. And memory, she realized, was more dangerous than any bomb. Far away in Brussels, NATO command scrambled. General Hale paced the floor of the command center, every step echoing like a gunshot in the silence of his staff. Advisors pleaded with him, demanding a response, some even urging him to brand Raven as a rogue, a traitor. Others warned that her face, her name, were already bleeding across unofficial channels. Every drone, every squad cam that had captured her voice, her strikes, her defiance, those feeds were too many to erase. "She's not a hero," Hale snapped, his voice hoarse with desperation. "She's a liability. If this becomes the narrative, if the world believes NATO abandoned Delta Force while a discarded pilot saved them, we lose more than credibility. We lose control." But deep down, even Hale knew the truth. Control was already gone. Back over the valley, Raven steadied the F-35, her HUD clearing as targets vanished from the screen. The enemy had broken. Delta Force was alive. For the first time since she had gripped the stick, her hands loosened. The battle was over. And then, the twist she hadn't expected. Her radar pinged. A new contact, high altitude, closing fast. At first she thought it was a straggler, a lone survivor of the shattered enemy force. But then the signature sharpened and her heart clenched. It wasn't enemy. It was friendly. NATO jets. 3 of them, her comms lit up with clipped, authoritative voices. Unidentified F-35, you are ordered to disengage and divert immediately. You are flying under unauthorized combat parameters. Failure to comply will be treated as hostile action. Raven's jaw tightened. After everything, after saving the men they'd abandoned, NATO's first instinct was not recognition, not gratitude, but suppression. She exhaled slowly, her hands firm on the controls. For a fleeting second, she considered fighting. She had already defied them, already rewritten the battlefield. Why not finish it? Why not tear down the last wall of silence with fire? But then she thought of Ruiz, of the men below who were alive because of her. If she turned her guns now, NATO would brand her a traitor, and those men would be caught in the fallout. She couldn't let them pay the price for her vengeance. Her voice came over the comms, calm, deliberate. "Tell General Hale this. You can chase me, you can bury me, but you can't erase me. Not anymore. The world saw what I did, and no matter how hard you try, they'll remember my name." The NATO jets flanked her, forcing her higher, away from the battlefield she had saved. Raven didn't resist, not because she was beaten, but because she had already won. Her victory wasn't in the sky, it was in the minds of every soldier she had saved, in the silence now haunting every general who had once dismissed her. Back in Brussels, Hale stood frozen as Raven's final transmission played across the command center. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against him, judging, condemning. He had silenced her once, but now her defiance echoed louder than any order he could give. On the ground, Ruiz and his surviving men stood on the ridge, smoke rising behind them. They watched the streak of Raven's jet vanish into the horizon, flanked by NATO fighters. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. In their eyes, she wasn't a rogue. She wasn't a mistake. She was the reason they were alive. And far above in the cockpit, Raven allowed herself one final breath of calm. They could strip her of medals, erase her from reports, paint her as an enemy. None of it mattered. The battlefield had already written her legacy in fire and silence. Isabella Raven Moretti was no longer just a forgotten pilot. She was a ghost that NATO could never bury again. The skies closed behind her as the horizon swallowed her jet, and with it the old story. The one where silence meant defeat, where humiliation meant the end. A new story had begun, written not by generals or governments, but by a woman who refused to stay erased. And in the silence that followed, the world listened. And that is how silence turned into fire, and how one forgotten woman shattered the skies when the world had already given up. Raven's story isn't just about war, it's about resilience, defiance, and the power hidden in those the world tries to erase. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Raven's place, cast aside, silenced, humiliated, would you have stepped back into the cockpit? Or would you have walked away? Your thoughts matter, and I'd love to read your take in the comments below. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If you felt the weight of this story, make sure to subscribe to A Simple Woman, where every silence hides power and every humiliation hides a twist you won't see coming. Don't forget to like, share, and leave your comment. We read every single one. And before you go, check out the other stories waiting for you on the screen right now. Each one will pull you deeper into the world where the forgotten rise and the impossible becomes unforgettable.